Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I want to go over the different mage specs going into Ulduar. So what are the different advantages to them? What's the DPS differences between the specs for Phase 1 Bis gear and Phase 2 Bis gear? And then based on all that information, give my overall recommendation, as well as my recommended spec for each boss. As always, the sections are timestamped in the description for your convenience, and also as always, please like and subscribe to the video, it really helps me out, and also please drop by twitch.tv/Kateri and drop me a follow if you haven't already, and thank you everyone for coming out there and showing me support. Because of that, we were able to hit partner, so the channel's hit partner, and I say we because it was all of you guys helping out and supporting the channel that we were able to do that, so thank you so much for doing that, it really means a lot. And then also, the Discord link is in the description if you want to join the Discord and ask questions, as well as participate in mage discussion there. First, I want to quick go over the general pros and cons of each spec, and then I'll go over their DPS differences in Phase 1 Bis gear and Phase 2 Bis gears. So first, for Arcane, we play it because it's better DPS than Fire for single target tank and spanks, and we play it for its burst damage. Now for Fire specs, in general we play Fire because it's better for multi-target encounters due to multi-dotting and cleaving with Living Bomb. It has better AoE if AoE is needed. It's better for fights with a lot of movement. And then this last reason depends on the player's skill, but in general Fire is easier to play optimally than it is to play Arcane optimally, as Arcane requires a little more player skill in terms of cooldown management and mana management. So Fire can be better for a player who isn't able to min-max during progression while they're still learning the fights, or maybe they just aren't able to min-max Arcane appropriately. So those are the general pros and cons, and here is also the latest DPS charts for Phase 1 Bis and Phase 2 Bis for all those different specs. And a huge shout out and thank you again to Safari84 for providing these. Here, MS refers to mana support, with that support being 1 Mana Tide and 1 Innervate, and FM refers to Focus Magic. The main takeaway that I want to point out here is that unfortunately, Arcane is ahead of Fire on single target tank and spanks, pretty much regardless of the fight length.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
So, yeah. With Phase 2 Bis, the gap between Arcane and Fire isn't as large as it was with Phase 1 Bis, but it is still there. Most of the fights in Ulduar either have pauses in the fight which break it up so it's not actually that lengthy, or they just aren't that long of encounters. And as you see here, even with a 5 or 6 minute fight, Arcane is still ahead even without mana support. And this is why a lot of the mage community has been cautious in saying that Arcane will be completely surpassed by Fire. And while some of us have been hopeful that Fire would surpass Arcane on even single target tank and spanks, that just isn't the case yet. And honestly, at this point, I think we'll be playing both specs until the end of the game, and what will determine the spec we're playing is the type of encounter that we're on. On the bright side, it makes playing the game a lot more interesting at the min-max level, since there's real variety in spec differences, and those differences matter, so there is that. With all of that, I'm now going to talk about the different specs that I'll be recommending, and I have separate specs for both progression and for farm that I'll be talking about, and then I'm going to go through each boss and say which spec I recommend for that boss. That said, I first need to state that you could be Arcane or Fire for almost all of these bosses and still clear the content, but if you want to play optimally, then I recommend you change spec based on the boss. The exceptions here being that you should always be Arcane if your raid needs the 3% damage buff that Arcane provides, and boss-wise, for Iron Council hard mode, you should always be Arcane, or at least until your raid's DPS is significantly better due to gearing upgrades, and for Yogg 1 Light and 0 Light, you should be Fire unless, again, your raid needs the 3% damage buff from Arcane. And I'll talk about these bosses more in their sections, of course. First, for Arcane, this is the progression spec that I recommend, and it mainly differs from the standard spec in that you're only getting 2 out of 3 ice shards, and you're giving up flex points that you would normally put into range or spirit or arcane barrage, and instead you're picking up magic absorption for plus 80 resist all, which is huge for survivability, as well as 2 out of 3 points in prismatic cloak, which reduces our damage taken by 4%. A lot of these fights are tough on the healers, and we really don't give up much DPS for the amount of survivability that this lends us, and it's very helpful since we're typically a squishy class, but with these talents we're a lot tougher. You could also drop that flex point from range that I have and get 3 out of 3 prismatic cloak if you wanted to. And for Algalon, I recommend doing that, and I'll talk about that in the Algalon section, or you could move that flex point to arcane barrage or more spirit. It's really up to you, I just like range. Now, once you have Ulduar hard modes on farm, then for Arcane, I recommend switching to the Incanter's Absorption spec. Main reason for this is that there's a number of uses for IA on boss encounters in Ulduar, such as Firefighter, Thorim, and even Hodir, and those uses will provide you extra damage and more survivability. There also isn't that much of a need for AoE on boss encounters, with the exception being the Detonator Lashers on Freya. So otherwise, I mean, the only thing Ice Shards is doing for you in Ulduar is speeding up trash a little, which really doesn't matter for Ulduar. What matters in Ulduar is ensuring the hard modes get killed, and that's why I recommend IA Spec. Now for fire, I first of course have to talk about Fire Torment the Weak versus Frostfire Bolt spec. You saw the graphs and how the damage differs between them, and that's now with double dipping being taken into account for FFB, and essentially their damage is very close. The main differences between the specs outside of that damage is that for Fire Torment the Weak it has clear casting, it can also pick up magic absorption for extra survivability, and it provides someone focus magic, and I'll talk about that more in a sec. For FFB, it requires less hit. It has Icy Veins for a little bit more burst than Fire Torment the Weak. It does more blizzard damage, which can be helpful for detonator lashers. It's more mana efficient for single target. It doesn't require a macro for Pyroblast to avoid Ignite Munching, but that's just kind of a quality of life thing, but still something to mention. And it doesn't rely on Torment the Weak activation, which is a damage boost for spots where the attack speed slow may not get applied to your target, such as Trees and Roots on Freya, Tentacles on Yogg-Saron, and even the Aerial Command unit in Phase 3 of Firefighter if your DKs aren't paying attention. Now on Focus Magic and their damage difference, again, both specs, it's very close, and it depends on who you're giving Focus Magic to. So Fire Torment the Weak could lead to about the same overall raid DPS as FFB, or a little better. It all depends on your situation, your gear, and who you're giving FM to. And you can estimate FM being between 150 to 175 DPS for if you're giving it to an Arcane Mage, Boomy, or Shadow Priest, and about 250 to 270 DPS if you're giving FM to a Fire Mage. It also makes the other player receiving FM pretty happy, and reciprocity is a thing in life, so there's that to take into account too. And while these are all things that should be taken into account for your choice of going Fire Torment the Weak versus FFB, the decision can kind of be simplified down to what is your hit gear like, because FFB has the advantage of only requiring hit being between 8% to 11%. And if you don't know why FFB Spec can get by with hit as low as 8%, then I recommend you go watch my FFB Double Dips video, which will explain that more in depth. But essentially, Frostfire Bolt, the spell, double dips from precision, so thus it only needs 8% hit, and any hit beyond that 8% is only helping your Living Bomb and Pyroblast. This makes having gear sets for both Arcane and FFB a lot easier than having gear sets for both Arcane and Fire Torment the Weak, because no one wants to regem after every time you swap specs, which in Ulduar is almost a boss by boss basis, so that means you need a lot of good hit pieces in order to be able to switch between Arcane and Fire Torment the Weak effectively. While that's not the case with Arcane and FFB, swapping between them is actually not too hard with the amount of hit you need. Thus, I think FFB makes sense as your fire spec if you're lacking in hit gear to hit the 14% hit that Fire Torment the Weak requires, and FFB can also make sense if your guild has the fights down, and thus you don't need the extra survivability that magic absorption brings, which only Fire Torment the Weak can pick up. Other reasons FFB makes sense is if you don't have a good focus magic target in your raid, and thus your raid's total DPS will be more with you being FFB, or it can make sense if you're having mana issues as Fire Torment the Weak. It can also make sense if you want FFB for a fight like Freya or Yogg-Saron, where Torment the Weak wouldn't always be activated for all the targets, as I explained earlier, so there is a number of reasons to be FFB. All that said, FFB cannot pick up magic absorption, which is a great talent for progression to make you more survivable while your heroes learn these fights. Also, I recommend Fire Torment the Weak during progression for some of the fights where you'll be fire, but otherwise when it comes down to choosing between Fire, Torment the Weak, and FFB,
the choices are yours and yours alone.
For Fire, this is the progression spec that I recommend, and as you can see, it's a Fire Torment the Weak build, and the reason for that is that we only give up a tiny amount of spirit and a little bit of mana efficiency for a lot more survivability from the magic absorption talent, which is an extra 80 resist all. That said, once your guild has the fights on farm, then you can spec back to the standard Fire Torment the Weak spec. The other thing to note here is that this spec is a hybrid between the single target Fire Torment the Weak spec and the AoE Fire Torment the Weak spec, and the reason for that is I opt to pick up Flame Throwing instead of Fire Starter, but still have Blast Wave, and more on that in a sec. And mainly it's because I don't view Dragon's Breath and Fire Starter as giving you that much value in Ulduar. There isn't much value for AoE in Ulduar boss encounters, outside of maybe breaking out NPCs on Hodir if they have to be clumped up enough, or maybe for an instant cast Flame Strike on the Detonator Lashers phase of Freya, but that's about it, and it's situational, and it's really just not necessary. Firestarter is only increasing your AoE DPS marginally in those few situations, and everywhere outside of those situations, it's just extra trash damage, and it isn't helping you guarantee the boss kill. Contrast that with Flame Throwing, where that 6 yards can make the difference for you being able to DPS roots or a tree on Freya, depending on where they spawn and where the mushrooms sprout, or on the last phase of Firefighter, where things are chaotic and the boss is being kited away from you. On Yogg, the range is also helpful for reaching tentacles, and the range can also be helpful for Hodir, depending on where moonbeams spawn and your tank has to move the boss. This is why I think Flame Throwing is more valuable than Firestarter. However, I still pick up Blast Wave because it's an extra knockback for the Detonator Lashers on Freya, and we found it pretty necessary, but for your situation, it might not be. And in that case, you could drop Blast Wave and pick up 3 out of 3 Master of Elements for better mana efficiency, and then that's basically the single target spec. All that said, the only difference between the Fire Torment the Weak progression spec and standard spec is changing points in the Arcane tree for magic absorption. For FFB, here is my recommended spec, which like the Fire Torment the Weak spec is a hybrid between the single target FFB and the AoE FFB spec, and it picks up flamethrowing over Firestarter, but still has Blast Wave for all the same reasons I previously mentioned for Fire Torment the Weak. Now that I've covered the different specs that I'll be recommending, I'm going to quick go through each boss and I'll say which of those specs I recommend and why. And also the focus is going to be here on the hard mode versions of the bosses. And one last thing, again, you should be Arcane if your raid doesn't have a 3% damage buff, and you can be Arcane for all the fights and still do well. Arcane is BIS for Flame Leviathan hard mode, because when we're launched on top of Flame Leviathan, we can kill the turrets incredibly quick with our burst damage trigger shutdown, and we can also fire ward as we're being launched on top of it, which will block some of the damage up there and prevent pushback, and we can also use Icy Veins to prevent pushback as well. So we can just kill those turrets incredibly quick, and then we can blink down to the ground directly to our motorcycle pickup right after we're launched off of Flame Leviathan following his shutdown, so definitely be Arcane for Flame Leviathan. For Ignis and Razorscale, these fights are easy and they don't have a hard mode, so you could be either spec. Doesn't really matter, although Arcane should do more DPS if you want to min-max. Arcane should also help you ensure you one-phase Razorscale so you can get that shit over with faster, but I mean, that's about it. For XT hard mode, I recommend Arcane because doing as much damage as you can to beat the enrage timer is what matters here. And the great thing about Arcane is that with its burst, you can help kill the heart without having to use Heroism or Lust, which allows your raid to use Heroism or Lust on the boss, which is a more effective use of Heroism and Lust in terms of overall raid DPS. And this is important since until we get geared up from Ulduar and have higher raid DPS, beating the enrage timer will actually be the difficult part of this boss, you know, unless of course like Blizzard nerfs XT from its current state. Also the extra survivability of the Arcane spec will be good here too. For Iron Council hard mode, Arcane is a must until your raid gets geared up. The reason it's a must is because the only difficult phase of the encounter is phase 3. The damage in the other phases really doesn't matter, and in phase 3 it's a DPS race to kill Steelbreaker before the second tank dies, and Arcane is huge for this with its burstiness in combination with the Rune of Power buff. Additionally, if you stack Arcane's cooldowns with the Rune of Power and also the Spell Steal buff from Morheim, you can do upwards of 16k DPS on Steelbreaker. It's insane, a lot of fun, and you just really need to be Arcane for this fight to help get you killed. Kologarn and Auriaya it doesn't really matter which spec you are, the fights are easy. But Fire seemed great with multi-dotting and cleave, so you could spec Fire if you really want to min-max them, but it doesn't matter. On Hodir hard mode, both specs can do well, but on average, Fire should do better with the amount of movement required to remove the Biting Cold debuff, where you can move anytime you have Hot Streak procs or have to refresh Living Bomb, and thus you can drop some of those Biting Cold stacks without sacrificing your DPS if you're playing Fire. Also for this fight, while magic absorption is great for taking less damage, the hardest part is of course making sure you kill Hodir before he destroys the treasure cache, which is about the 2 minutes and 5 seconds into the fight. And thus DPS here is the highest priority, and you really shouldn't be taking much damage anyways if you keep your Biting Cold stacks low, and so for this reason I don't recommend the progression spec. Instead, I actually recommend FFB over Fire Torment the Weak for your spec here, because FFB has Icy Veins, which allows for more cooldown stacking with the Storm Power buff, and the crit damage modifier of Storm Power looks to benefit FFB a little more than it does for Fire Torment the Weak. And properly utilizing the Storm Power buff is what makes or breaks you killing the boss in time for the hard mode achievement. On the other hand, Fire Torment the Weak does have Focus Magic and gives another caster 3% crit, and crit is pretty big on this boss. So Fire Torment the Weak having that Focus Magic scaling still makes it a great choice. So if your Fire spec is Fire Torment the Weak, I'm not saying you have to respec to FFB every time you go to kill Hodir, but I am saying that the respec to FFB could be worth it for your first Hodir kill. On Thorim hard mode, both Arcane and Fire perform pretty well, however I recommend Arcane as the fight is relatively short, the movement is minimal, and Arcane should take the edge with Incanter's absorption. Arcane with IA can use Frost Ward to absorb Sif's Frostbolt Volley and Frost Nova, which can return a ton of mana with a Frost Warding proc, and it also gives you the damage boost from IA and also helps out your healers with survivability. Even without IA, Arcane does more single target damage than Fire, as we know, and while there is a little bit of movement on this fight, Arcane can utilize Palm and Rocket Boots to mitigate Arcane's DPS loss from that movement, and then the few blinks that are needed for any subsequent movement aren't enough to put Arcane below Fire DPS wise. So overall, I recommend Arcane. But that said, Arcane requires you to be smart with your cooldown usage, so don't use your cooldowns right before Thorim's lightning charge is about to go out, or you'll be big sad and then you actually will lose to the Fire Mage. So just play smart, and Arcane should be the better choice here. Freya is another fight where both specs can perform well, but overall I recommend Fire here. The thing Arcane has going for it, it does has the benefit of being able to burst through roots and trees faster than Fire, which is a definite boon to Arcane spec, as those targets require priority DPS when they spawn. However, Fire pulls ahead with its ability to multi-dot and cleave the 3-target phase. It has better AoE on the lashers, where living bomb explosions really help finish off the adds once they're low, and Fire's extra range can make the difference for being able to reach a tree or some roots from your current mushroom. And Fire also has the ability ability to knock back the lashers with Blast Wave, and all these reasons put together put Fire a little bit above Arcane for Freya. During progression, I do recommend the Fire Torment to Weak progression build, as the Magic Absorption talent will help reduce damage from Roots, Solar Beam, Solar Flare, and Nature's Fury. But once you have the fight down, you could go FFB for better burst on the Conservator phase, and FFB should also be a little more damage on the trees and roots, as TTW may not always be active when attacking them. Firefighter is again another fight where both specs can perform well, but overall I do recommend Fire here. First I'll talk about Arcane strengths, and for Arcane it does benefit from the downtime between each phase in order to regen mana and evocate, and if you go IA Spec as Arcane, casting Fire Ward between each phase and also Fire Warding in phase 2 is great for activating IA and getting some easy Frost Warding procs, and it also helps out the healers. But that said, the amount of movement within this fight is pretty substantial, and Fire's ability to multi-dot and cleave with Living Bomb in phase 3 and 4 definitely looks to put Fire ahead on overall. The extra range from Fire can also be a big help depending on how targets need to be kited and where the fire has spawned and is growing, but most importantly in phase 4 you can Living Bomb all 3 targets and all 3 will be cleaved from the explosions, and then they also start out at 50% HP, so you quickly get that extra 12% execute damage from the Molten Fury talent. So all that together for me puts Fire ahead of Arcane. As for which Fire spec I recommend, here I recommend the Fire Torment to Weak progression spec, as the 80 resist all can help out healers a lot. That said, once your raid has this fight on farm, you could go either Fire Torment to Weak or FFB, with FFB having a tiny edge over Fire Torment to Weak, as FFB has Icy Veins for more burst damage on the head vulnerability in phase 3. For General Vezax, I have to be honest and say we didn't do it on hard mode on the PTR, because we were just more focused on other bosses. We may do it if the PTR happens again, and if so, I'll update the pinned comment on this video with my recommendation. But my current recommendation is Arcane, based on it producing less threat and being more mana efficient as long as you play smart with it. But this could be wrong, and again, I'll update the pinned comment once we've done the fight and I have an actual recommendation for sure.
God.
Oh yeah, baby. It's about to get juicy in here.
God fucking damn it, dude.
For Yogg, for both Yogg 1 Light and Yogg 0 Light, my recommendation is the same, and that recommendation is Fire. So phase 1 is easy and is not a DPS race, so while Arcane can do more damage in phase 1, it doesn't matter. Phase 2 and 3 are what matters, and Fire pumps more damage in phase 2 due to its ability to multi-dot and cleave the tentacles with Living Bomb, and then in phase 3, Fire has the advantage of being able to Living Bomb Yogg and the Immortal Guardians while being faced away from the boss. And this allows Fire to do not just more overall damage in phase 3, but also more single target damage to Yogg-Saron when compared to Arcane. And that single target damage to Yogg-Saron is what matters most in phase 3, and being Fire allowed me to stray not too far behind the Affliction locks on Yogg-Saron damage on our kill. Also, for the type of Fire spec, I definitely recommend FFB, as the tentacles won't always have TTW activated on them, and this is a long encounter, and the mana efficiency of FFB is super helpful, especially if you get the Draining Poison debuff cast on you and it doesn't get dispelled right away. For subsequent Yogg 0 kills, you may not need to be FFB, and Fire Torment to Weak could be good enough, but I would highly recommend going FFB for your first Yogg-Saron kill. Finally, we have Algalon, the Tank Destroyer. On Algalon, I recommend Arcane because you don't need any of the strengths of Fire spec, and Algalon is all about your ability to survive collapsing stars while pumping out as much damage as you can. And Arcane excels at both with its better single target damage, and since it can pick up survivability in the talent tree while giving up minimal damage, such as getting resist all from magic absorption and damage reduction from the Prismatic Cloak talent. That extra damage from the Prismatic Cloak talent is very helpful for ensuring you always survive collapsing stars, and it also allows you to use an SP flask and still survive collapsing stars, while otherwise as a fire mage you'd probably need to use a resist flask or wear some resist gear in order to ensure you survive it 100% of the time. And all of that would be a DPS loss. So I would even go 3 out of 3 Prismatic Cloak here as Arcane, and I really feel like Arcane is definitely the play. Alright everyone, that's all I got for recommendations. I hope they help. I hope you had a great happy holidays as well, and thank you so much for watching. Also, like and subscribe if you like the content, really it helps me out. Drop me a follow at twitch.tv/Criteria, and also join the Discord if you have further questions about this or want to discuss more things or have other questions. Also, anytime I stream, that's a great time to be asking me questions as well. I get tons of DMs every day, so stream time is actually the best time to just reach out to me if you have any kind of questions on anything. And yeah, thanks for watching. Cheers.
See what happens. If he gets low and he hasn't cast it. Oh, stop!
Push,
Kill.
Just kill.
Paints
Alright,
up, paints up.
Oh no.
Oh no. What?
That's so good.
What kind
That
of roll
happens
was
every once
that?
in a while. That happens every once in a while.
That's a troll.
Did he just...
Yikes.
Did he soulstone and rune of death?